I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office checking the bank balance against Fritz's grocery receipts, a task that usually makes me appreciate how much a genius can eat, when the doorbell rang. It was 9:02 Tuesday morning. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms where he'd been since 9, probably telling Miltonia that its petals were a fraction off colour. The day had all the markings of a quiet one, which in this house usually means a storm is brewing just past the horizon. When I looked through the one-way glass of the front door, I didn't see a billionaire in a panic or a widow in weeds. I saw a kid, maybe 20, looking like he just crawled out of a library and realized the sun was too bright. He was wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better decades and was clutching a manila envelope as if it contained the secret to cold fusion. I opened the door and gave him the look I reserve for people who might be selling something I don't want. "If you're looking for the tutoring center, it's 3 blocks over," I said. "If you're looking for Nero Wolfe, he's currently in a state of grace with some orchids and won't be back on this planet until 11. The kid didn't blink. He just held out the envelope. "My name is Julian Thorne. I was told that Mr. Wolfe is the only man who can read what's inside this without it disappearing. My grandfather, Arthur Thorne, said to tell him that ivy has begun to choke the oak." I stood there for a second. Arthur Thorne was a name that carried a lot of weight in the kind of circles that don't like being circled. He'd been a titan of the old New York legal scene before he retreated to a mansion in Westchester that was more fortress than home. "The ivy and the oak, huh?" I said, taking the envelope. It felt heavy, but not paper. It had the distinct, metallic heft of a key and something else. Something that rattled like old bones. "All right, Julian, come in and have a seat in the front room. I'll see if the boss is willing to descend from the clouds early, though I wouldn't bet my lunch on it." I put him in the small front room and went to the house phone. I buzzed the plant rooms, and when Wolfe answered, he sounded like I'd just informed him the beer supply had run dry. "Yes, Archie. We have a messenger from Arthur Thorne," I said, "a grandson named Julian. He brought an envelope and a message about ivy choking an oak. He looks like he hasn't slept since the mid-50s. There was silence on the other end, not the silence of an annoyed man, but the silence of a man who has just heard a ghost rattle a chain he thought he'd locked 20 years ago. "Did he mention a color?" Wolfe asked, his voice lower than usual. "Just the greenery," I replied. "Why? Is there a horticultural emergency I should know about?" "Bring the envelope to the office, Archie, and tell the young man he will wait. I shall be down in 10 minutes. I hung up, feeling that familiar itch in my palms. For Wolfe, to leave his orchids 10 minutes early was equivalent to the sun rising in the west. I went to the office, sat at my desk, and waited. When Wolfe finally appeared, the elevator's groan sounding like a dirge, he didn't look at me. He walked straight to his desk, sat in the chair that was the only piece of furniture in the world capable of supporting his ego and his bulk, and gestured toward the envelope. "Open it," he commanded. I used the letter opener. Out came a heavy brass key, old, the kind that looks like it belongs to a cathedral, and a small dried sprig of ivy. But it wasn't just any ivy. The leaves were stained a deep dark crimson. It wasn't paint, and it wasn't ink. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He didn't touch the spring. "Arthur Thorne is dead, Archie." "Dead?" Julian didn't mention it. He said his grandfather sent him. Julian is mistaken, or he is a very good actor. Arthur Thorne died 4 hours ago. I received a private wire before I went to the plants. This spring, this is the ivy he feared. It represents a pact made in a basement 40 years ago, a pact that Arthur believed he could outlive. "And the key?" I asked. Wolfe's eyes moved to the brass object. "The key belongs to a box that doesn't exist, or rather, a box that shouldn't exist. Arthur Thorne has spent 40 years paying for the privilege of keeping that key in a drawer. Now that he is dead, the drawer has been opened." He looked at the door toward the front room. "Julian Thorne is no a messenger, Archie. He is a target, and by bringing that key into this house, he has made the brownstone a target as well." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle, a gesture that usually meant he was settling in for a long, expensive thought. We shall take the case, not for the boy, and certainly not Arthur Thorne's ghost. We shall take it because someone has had the audacity to send a dead man's blood into my office on a Tuesday morning. I reached for my notebook. The quiet day was officially over. By the time the clock on the mantel struck 11, the office felt as though the walls had moved a few inches. Julian Thorne was no longer sitting in the front room. I had moved him into the red leather chair facing Wolfe's desk, where he looked like a small, pale ghost against the backdrop of 4,000 books. The manila envelope sat on the blotter between them, the crimson-stained ivy appearing darker under the glow of the desk lamp. Wolfe hadn't touched his beer. He was staring at Julian with a look that suggested he was trying to decide if the boy was a victim of circumstance or a very sophisticated delivery system for a disaster. Outsiders in the brownstone always bring a certain kind of dust with them, not the kind you can sweep away, but a film of tension that settles over the furniture and makes the air feel thick. Julian was leaning forward, his hands gripped so tightly on his knees that his knuckles were white. He'd just finished explaining that he hadn't known his grandfather was dead until I told him, a revelation that had sent him into a silent, shaking fit for 5 minutes before he could get his tongue to work again. "He gave me the envelope last night," Julian whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "He told me that if he didn't come down for breakfast by 8, I was to take a cab straight here. He said you were the only man who wouldn't be afraid of the key. He didn't tell me what it was for. He didn't tell me about the blood on the ivy." Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep subterranean dissatisfaction. "Mr. Thorne, your grandfather was a man who spent his life quantifying risks. He did not send you here because he trusted my courage. He sent you because he trusted my selfishness. He knew I would not tolerate an unsolved riddle on my doorstep. Now, tell me about the others in the house last night. Who was present when Arthur Thorne retired?" The circle of outsiders began to take shape as Julian spoke. It wasn't just family. Arthur Thorne's mansion had been a hive of activity in his final hours. There was Silas Vane, the business partner who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of ice, Clara Thorne, the daughter who had spent 20 years waiting for her inheritance with the patience of a vulture, and a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, a distant cousin and the family physician who had been the one to officially pronounce the death. Finally, there was the personal secretary, a man named Himes, who Julie and described as a shadow that followed his grandfather even into the bathrooms. As Julian spoke, I watched Wolfe. He remained perfectly still, his eyes half closed, a human mountain of suspicion. He didn't like the numbers. 4 people, all with a reason to want the old man's keys, and all with the opportunity to make sure he didn't wake up for breakfast. The sanctity of the brownstone felt compromised simply by the admission of these names into the atmosphere. For Wolfe, a murder isn't just a crime, it's a vulgar disruption of the natural order, and having the grandson of the victim shaking in his office was the ultimate breach of decorum. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through Julian's rambling description of the family lawyer. "The boy is exhausted. Take him to the south room on the 3rd floor. Inform Fritz that he is a guest, but he is not to leave that floor without your supervision. I want the house secured. If anyone arrives claiming to represent the Thorne estate, they are to wait on the stoop. I will not have my hall cluttered with the bereaved." I stood up and nudged Julian toward the door. He followed me like a sleepwalker. I got him settled in the south room, told him the rules of the house, which mostly involved staying out of Wolfe's way and not touching the orchids, and then I went back down to the office. Wolfe was finally drinking his beer, but he wasn't enjoying it. He was staring at the brass key. "The dust is settling, Archie," he remarked as I, too, came my seat. "And it is bitter. Arthur Thorne was murdered, and he was murdered because of what that key opens. The Ivy is a fraternity of sorts, a group of men who, 4 decades ago, decided that the law was a suggestion and profit was a mandate. They called themselves the Ivy League Cadre, a whimsical name for a group of thieves in silk hats. Arthur was the keeper of their ledger. That key opens the box where the ledger is kept. And the blood on the ivy?" I asked. "A warning from the other members." "A signature," Wolfe corrected. "One of the cadre is still alive, and he is a man of dramatic flair. He killed Arthur to get the key, failed to find it, and sent the spring to Julian as a way of tracking him. By bringing the boy here, we have invited the cadre to West 35th Street. I checked the brass bolt on the front door. Well, they'll have a hard time getting in, but that doesn't help us find out which of the mansion suspects actually did the deed. If the cadre is still active, any one of them could be the front man. Precisely, Wolfe said, his eyes opening fully, which is why you will be spending your afternoon in Westchester. I want you to observe the mourners, Archie. Look for the one who isn't mourning the man, but the missing brass in his pocket, and find out where Arthur kept his oak. If the ivy is choking it, there must be a physical tree, or a reasonable facsimile, involved. I reached for my hat. The brownstone felt quiet again, but it was the silence of a coil. Ed Spring. The outsiders were in our heads now, and before the day was out, I had a feeling they'd be at our door. Wolfe settled back into his chair, the master of the house once again, but I knew he was listening to the silence, waiting for the first crack in the foundation. The drive up to Westchester was a scenic route through the kind of money that doesn't shout, it just hums a low-expensive tune. Arthur Thorne's mansion, known to the locals as the Oaks, was a sprawling piece of Gothic revival, smothered in actual ivy, that looked old enough to have witnessed the signing of the Constitution. I left the Heron in the gravel circle and spent a moment taking in the atmosphere. It smelled of wet stone and ancient grudges. By the time I reached the massive oak front door, I already had a pretty good idea of why Julian Thorne looked like a nervous wreck. Living in a mausoleum like this would give anyone a permanent case of the jitters. A butler, who looked like he had been cured in salt, let me in and led me to the library, where the survivors had gathered to sharpen their knives. It was a room that would have made Wolfe's office look like a hobby shop. 3 walls were nothing but dark wood and leather bindings, and the 4th was a window looking out onto a garden that was losing its fight with the autumn chill. The suspects were arranged around the room like chess pieces on a board that had been overturned. Silas Vane was standing by the fireplace, nursing a glass of something tea. Hat wasn't water. He was a tall, angular man with a nose that belonged on a Roman coin, and eyes that seemed to be calculating the depreciation of the furniture. Beside him was Clara Thorne, the daughter. She was wearing enough black lace to drape a hearse, but her eyes were dry and sharp, darting toward me with a look of pure, unadulterated suspicion. Dr. Aris Thorne was sitting in a winged-back chair, looking at his fingernails with a clinical detachment that made me want to check my pulse. Finally, there was Himes, the secretary, standing in the corner like a piece of drapery. He was small, grey, and had the kind of face that you forget the moment he stops talking. "My name is Archie Goodwin," I said, giving the room a general nod. "I'm here for Nero Wolfe. Julian arrived at our house this morning with a delivery, and Mr. Wolfe felt it was only polite to send me along to offer our condolences and to ask a few questions about the ivy." The silence that followed was heavy enough to drop through the floor. Silas Vane was the first to move, setting his glass down with a precise, metallic click. "Nero Wolfe? That fat charlatan from 35th Street? My partner's body isn't even cold yet, and his grandson is already running to a private detective. It's an embarrassment, Goodwin. Arthur died of a heart ailment. There is no mystery here. A heart ailment that leaves a sprig of crimson-stained ivy in a man's bedside drawer?" I asked, watching Clara's face. She didn't flinch, but her grip on her lace handkerchief tightened until the fabric threatened to tear. "Mr. Wolfe has a particular interest in botany, especially when the plants are dripping with old secrets. And Julian didn't just bring flowers, he brought a message about the oak." Dr. Aris Thorne looked up, a thin, patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Arthur was a man of metaphors, Mr. Goodwin. In his final hours he was prone to rambling. The ivy and the oak was a phrase he used often to describe the burden of his legal legacy. To suggest anything more is a flight of fancy that borders on the ghoulish." I didn't argue. Instead, I spent the next half-hour circulating, playing the part of the inquisitive but harmless assistant. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Silas Vane wasn't just mourning a partner, he was terrified. Every time a floorboard creaked, he practically jumped out of his skin. Clara wasn't interested in the mystery. She was interested in the safe behind the portrait of the Thorne matriarch, her eyes drifting toward it with a frequency that was almost rhythmic. Himes, the secretary, was the most interesting of the lot. He didn't speak, but he watched everyone with a gaze that was far too intelligent for a man who was supposed to be a human filing cabinet. The real discovery came when I stepped out into the hallway to find a telephone. I passed a door that led to Arthur's private study and noticed the heavy moulding around the frame. It wasn't ivy carved into the wood, it was as oak leaves, and in the center of the door, where a knob should have been, was a keyhole that looked exactly like it would fit the brass cathedral key currently sitting on Wolfe's desk. I didn't try the door. Instead, I headed back to the library just in time to catch Julian's cousin, Dr. Arris, whispering something to Silas Vane. I caught 3 words: the ledger's gone. When I left the Oaks at 4 o'clock, I had a notebook full of observations and a head full of questions. The Ivy League cadre wasn't just a piece of history, it was a living, breathing tension in that house. Silas was the money, Clara was the motive, and Arris was the means. But Himes was the one who knew where the keys were kept. I drove back to the city, the afternoon light fading into a bruised purple over the Hudson. The brownstone felt like a fortress when I pulled up, and for the first time in my career I was glad for the brass bolt on the door. I went straight to the office, where Wolfe was waiting with a fresh bottle of beer and a look that said he had already solved the puzzle and was just waiting for me to catch up. "The suspects are all present and accounted for," I told him, throwing my hat onto the rack. "They're all lying, they're all scared, and they've all got their eyes on the study door. And Arris Thorne thinks the ledger is missing. If one of them has it, they're doing a hell of a job, pretending they don't." Wolfe grunted, his eyes fixed on the red-crimson ivy sprig. "They don't have it, Archie. If they had it, Arthur wouldn't have had the time to send the key. They are looking for the oak, and they are terrified that the ivy has found it first. Now tell me about the secretary. Does he look like a man who could pick a lock or a man who already has the master?" "He looks like a man who knows the weight of every secret in that house," I said. "And I'm starting to think he's the one who's been watering the ivy." I sat at my desk and began to transcribe my notes. The circle was closing, and the cadre was no longer just a name from the past. It was a pressure building inside the brownstone, and before the night was out, I knew that someone was going to try to break the seal. The morning after my trip to Westchester began with a light drizzle that turned the city the color of a wet sidewalk, which matched my mood perfectly. Wolfe was in his morning session with the orchids, probably lecturing a Miltonia on the merits of staying in one place, while I was out playing detective in the real world. My first stop was a small, cramped office in the Flatiron district, belonging to a firm called Thorne, Vane and Associate. The associate had been dead for 10 years, and from the look of the lobby, the firm wasn't far behind. I was there to see what the public record wouldn't tell me about the Ivy League cadre. I spent 3 hours at a local diner across from the office building, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a wool sock. My target was a retired clerk named Benson, who had worked for Silas Vane for 30 years before being let go with a handshake and a cheap watch. Saul Panzer had tracked him down for me, and after 20 minutes of me listening to his complaints about his pension, Benson finally started talking about the old days. He remembered the Ivy League cadre, all right. He said they were a group of 4 men: Arthur Thorne, Silas Vane, a judge named Miller, and a man who went by the name of the Gardener. "Why the Gardener?" I asked, leaning in. Benson let out a raspy chuckle. "Because he was the one who trimmed the hedges, Goodwin. If a witness got too loud or a competitor got too close, the Gardener made sure they were pruned. He was never on the letterhead, but he was the one who kept the ivy growing. Arthur Thorne was the head, Silas was the money, and the Gardener was the muscle. After Miller died in that hunting accident 20 years ago, the group went quiet, but the money kept flowing into a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. I left Benson and headed to a dusty archive in the basement of a library on 42nd Street. I wanted to see a picture of this Gardener. I dug through old society pages and legal journals from the late 80s, looking for any face that appeared consistently in the background of Arthur Thorne's public life. I finally found it in a grainy photo of a victory party after a major corporate merger. Standing 3 feet behind Arthur Thorne was a man with a face like a blank slate. He was young then, but the eyes were unmistakable. It was Himes, the personal secretary I had seen at the Oaks. He hadn't been a shadow, he had been the silent partner, the man who stayed in the dark so the others could stay in the light. By the time I got back to the brownstone at 3 o'clock, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour. I found Wolfe in the office, staring at a map of New York as if he could see the invisible lines of the cadre's influence stretching across the boroughs. I gave him the news about Himes and the gardener, and he didn't even blink. He just nodded, his lips moving in a silent calculation. "So, Himes is the muscle," I said, throwing my wet coat onto the rack. "That makes him the most dangerous man in the house. And if he's still loyal to the cadre, he's the one who killed Arthur for the key. But why send the ivy to Julian? If Himes has the ledger, he doesn't need the boy." "Himes does not have the ledger," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble. "He has the means to kill, but he does not have the location of the oak." Arthur Thorne was a man of supreme irony, Archie. He knew Himes would eventually include him. He didn't hide the ledger in a safe or a vault. He hid it in plain sight, in a place where only the key would reveal it. Himes sent the ivy to Julian because he believed the boy knew Oak's secret. When Julian fled to us, Himes realized that the hunt had moved to West 35th Street. I sat at my desk and looked at the brass cathedral key. It looked innocent enough, but I knew it was the center of a storm. Well, if Himes is coming here, he's going to have a hard time. Saul is keeping an eye on the mansion, and I've got the front door bolted. "Himes will not come through the front door," Wolfe remarked, his eyes half closing. "A gardener prefers the service entrance. He will wait for a crack in our routine, a moment when the sanctity of the house is distracted by a more pressing matter. He is a patient man, Archie. He has waited 40 years for this ledger. He can wait another 40 hours. Well, we don't have 40 hours, I countered. Clara Thorne and Silas Vane are already filing for an injunction to have Julian returned to Westchester. They're claiming he's mentally unstable and that we're holding him against his will. If the police show up with a court order, we're going to have a lot of explaining to do." Wolfe's eyes snapped open. "They will not have the boy. Julian Thorne is the only living person who can witness the opening of the oak. Archie, I want you to go to the kitchen. Tell Fritz to prepare a tray for Julian. While you are there, check the pantry spice jars, specifically the jar marked for mace." I looked at him. "Mace? Why? Are we expecting a medieval siege?" "Just check the jar, Archie, and do not be surprised if the lid has been tampered with. The ivy has a way of creeping into the smallest spaces." I went to the kitchen, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with rain outside. The brownstone felt different today, larger and more full of shadows. I found Fritz in the pantry, looking puzzled. He held a small glass jar. The label said mace, but inside was a sprig of dried ivy stained with that same dark crimson hue. Someone had been inside our kitchen, inside our sanctuary, and we hadn't heard a thing. The gardener was already here. I didn't tell Fritz to panic, mostly because Fritz doesn't know how to do anything but provide impeccable service, and a panicked chef is a tragedy I wasn't prepared to handle. I took the jar of mace from him with a steady hand, but my stomach felt like it had been tied in a clove hitch. I walked back into the office and set the jar on the edge of Wolfe's desk, right next to the brass key in the original spring. The red stain on the leaves inside the jar looked fresh, as if the ivy were still drinking. Wolfe didn't even look. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his fingers tap-tap-tapping against the arms of his chair. It was a rhythmic, maddening sound that usually meant he was either counting to 10 to avoid a tantrum or weighing the life of a human being against the inconvenience of a disrupted schedule. "The pantry, Archie?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Right behind the cinnamon," I said. "Fritz didn't see a thing. The back door was locked, the basement windows are bolted, and the alarm hasn't let out a peep. Yet someone got in, walked past the kitchen table, and decided to leave a floral arrangement in our spices. It makes me feel like I'm losing my touch, or we're dealing with a ghost." "Not a ghost," Wolfe murmured. "A man who understands the architecture of this city. The brownstone is old, but the earth beneath it is older. There are service tunnels and forgotten vaults that date back to the time of the draft riots. A man who has spent 40 years as a gardener for the Thorne family would have access to maps that the city planners have long since misplaced. He isn't walking through walls, Archie. He's walking through the foundation." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the blueprints of the house I had made 5 years ago when we did the plumbing. I spread them out over my desk, but Wolfe didn't even glance at them. "They won't be there," he said. "Look for the gap between the basement wall and the neighbor's property line." There is a space of 3 feet that is unaccounted for. It was a coal chute once, then a drainage pipe, and now it is a doorway. Our intruder didn't need to pick a lock, he simply removed a stone. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was half irritation and half readiness. If he can get into the pantry, he can get into the office. Or Julian's room. Why the spice jar? Why not just take the boy while we were sleeping? Because the gardener is a creature of habit, Wolfe remarked, finally reaching for his beer. He does not want the boy yet. He wants the key, and he wants to ensure that our own vulnerabilities efficiently distracts us. Ivy Mace is a psychological maneuver. He is telling us that the brownstone is no longer ours. It is a siege of the mind, Archie, and he is winning because you are looking at the doors instead of the logic. I sat down and tried to let my heart rate return to something resembling normal. All right, so he's under the floorboards. What about the oak? If the ivy is here, the oak must be somewhere close. You said Arthur Thorne hid it in plain sight. I looked all over that mansion in Westchester and didn't see anything but old books and bad attitudes. Wolfe's eyes traveled to the wall map of New York, specifically the grid of Manhattan. Arthur Thorne was a creature of Manhattan, not Westchester. He built that mansion to satisfy his daughter's vanity, but his heart remained in the city where the cadre was born. Think, Archie, where is the one place in this city where an oak would be allowed to stand for 40 years without being questioned? Where would a man with a brass key find a lock that looks like a cathedral? I thought back to the key. It was heavy, ornate, and looked like it belonged on a massive wooden door. St. Jude's, I whispered. The old chapel on 34th Street. Arthur Thorne was a vestryman there for 30 years. He funded the renovation of the North Transept. And the North Transept is famous for its woodwork, Wolfe added, a faint light of satisfaction appearing in his eyes. Specifically, the carved screen of the Thorne Memorial Altar. It is made of English oak, harvested from the Thorne estate in Sussex. To the casual observer, it is a work of piety. To a man with that key, it is a filing cabinet. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they made was a dark one. If we know it, the gardener knows. He's probably at the chapel right now with a crowbar. He cannot open it without the key, Wolfe said. The lock is a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. If he tries to force it, the mechanism will jam, and the contents will be destroyed by a concentrated acid bath. Arthur Thorne was thorough. The gardener needs that brass on my desk, and he believes that by trespassing in our kitchen he can force a trade. The doorbell rang then, not the polite chime of a visitor, but a long, demanding peal that echoed through the hall. I checked the one-way glass. It wasn't the gardener. It was a man in a dark suit with a briefcase, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Silas Vane had arrived with his injunction. The law is at the door, I told Wolfe, and they've brought the heavy lifting. If I don't open it, they'll kick it in. If I do, they'll take Julian, and we'll be left with a jar of ivy and a dead man's key. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't even look toward the hall. Open the door, Archie, but do not bring them to the office. Take them to the front room. Tell them Julian Thorne is currently under a doctor's care and cannot be moved. And while they are arguing with you, I want you to go to the basement. Do not look for the gardener. Look for the missing stone. If he is still in the tunnels, he will have left a trail. I want to know exactly how deep the ivy has grown. I headed for the door, my hand resting on the brass bolt. The brownstone was no longer a fortress, it was a stage, and the first act was about to get very crowded. The gardener was on the walls, the law was on the porch, and Nero Wolfe was sitting in his chair playing a game of chess where the board was made of blood and oak. I handled the law on the porch with the kind of practiced politeness that makes a man want to hit you. It took 15 minutes of stalled conversation and a very creative description of Julian Thorne's supposed nervous collapse to keep the 2 uniformed officers from marching up the stairs. I left them in the front room with Silas Vane, who was pacing the floor and looking at his watch as if he were timing the death of his patients. Once I was sure they were occupied with a stack of old magazines and their own indignation, I slipped through the dining room and headed for the basement stairs. The basement of the brownstone is a place of shadows and old stone, smelling of furnace oil and the dampness of the Manhattan soil. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I used a heavy-duty flashlight, keeping the beam low and narrow. I headed straight for the south wall, near the old wine racks. Wolfe had mentioned a gap, a space of 3 feet between our foundation and the property next door. I moved a crate of empty bottles and saw it, a vertical crack in the masonry that looked natural, until you noticed that the mortar had been replaced with something that looked like dark grey modelling clay. I didn't have to push hard. A section of the wall, roughly the size of a man's torso, swung inward on a pivot I hadn't known existed. Beyond it lay a tunnel, narrow, dripping with condensation, and choked with the thick, ropey vines of a plant that shouldn't have been able to grow in the dark. It was ivy, but it was pale, almost translucent, stretching toward the house like reaching fingers. I stepped through the opening, the air turning cold and tasting of ancient dust. I followed the tunnel for about 20 yards until it opened into a vaulted chamber that wasn't on any city map I'd ever seen. It looked like a forgotten storage cellar for a 19th century merchant, but it had been renovated. There was a folding table, a single chair, and a lantern that was still warm to the touch, but it was the walls that caught my eye. They were covered in photographs, dozens of them, all taken from a distance. There were shots of the brownstone's front door, the service entrance, and even the roof of the plant rooms. And in the center of the table, sitting on a piece of velvet, was a set of lock-picking tools that looked like they belonged in a museum of surgical instruments. The gardener wasn't there, but his shadow was everywhere. I reached out to pick up a scrap of paper on the blay, when I heard a faint, rhythmic sound from the darkness ahead. It wasn't a footstep, it was the dry, rasping sound of a blade being drawn across a whetstone. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I didn't wait to be introduced. I backed out of the chamber, moved through the hidden door, and reset the stone. My heart was doing a drum solo against my ribs. I ran back up the stairs, past the kitchen where Fritz was humming a tune, and burst into the office. Wolfe was still in his chair, but he wasn't alone. Saul Panzer had arrived through the back way, looking as inconspicuous as a retired grocery clerk in his old brown cap and worn jacket. "Saul found the tail," I said, leaning against the desk to catch my breath. "The black sedan that followed me from Westchester? It's parked 2 blocks on 9th Avenue, but that's the small news. I found the gardener's nest. He's in the tunnels under the south wall, and he's not down there to read the morning paper. He's sharpening a knife, and he's got pictures of every window in this house." Saul nodded, his face a mask of quiet competence. "I saw him, Archie. I was checking the perimeter of the chapel on 34th Street when I spotted a man in a grey utility suit slipping into a manhole in the alley. I didn't follow him down. I knew he'd have the advantage in the dark, but I waited. He left 10 minutes later near the subway entrance. He's fast, and he knows every inch of the underground." Wolfe's eyes were open now, 2 dark orbs of cold, hard focus. "He's preparing the final pruning, Saul. He realized the law would provide the perfect cover. While Silas Vane is in our front room demanding the boy, the gardener intends to use the distraction to take the key and eliminate the witness. But he has made a tactical error. He assumes I am playing a defensive game. Well, it feels pretty defensive from where I'm standing, I noted. We've got a killer in the basement and an injunction in the parlor." "No longer," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that tone of finality that meant the orchestration was complete. "Saul, you will return to the chapel. I want you to find the Thorn Memorial altar. Do not touch woodwork, but make sure no one else does. Archie, you will return to the front room. Tell Mr. Vane that Julian is ready to see him, but only in the presence of his attorney. Invite them into the office. I want Ivy to see the oak before it falls." "You're going to give them the key?" I asked, looking at the brass cathedral piece on the blotter. "I am going to give them the truth," Wolfe corrected, "and the truth is a far more dangerous object than a piece of brass. Go, Archie. The gardener is waiting for the lights to go out. We shall ensure they stay very, very bright." I headed back to the front room, my hand resting on the grip of the .38 in my shoulder holster. The rain was still drumming against the windows, a steady, hypnotic beat. I could feel the pressure of the house, the weight of the secrets buried beneath the floorbow. Odds, and the cold, reaching fingers of the ivy. The siege was about to move from the shadows into the light of the office, and I had a feeling that before the night was through, someone was going to discover that Nero Wolfe's sanctuary was a very dangerous place to trespass. I walked back into the front room with a face that wouldn't have told a professional card player whether I had a royal flush or a pair of deuces. Silas Vane stopped his pacing and glared at me, his Roman nose twitching with indignation. The two uniformed officers looked relieved to have something to do besides read 6-month-old copies of a gardening magazine. I ignored the law for a second and focused on Vane. I told him that Mr. Wolfe had reconsidered and was prepared to discuss the transition of Julian Thorne's guardianship, provided it was done in the office under the proper supervision of his legal counsel. Vane looked like he'd just won a marathon he hadn't trained for, and he practically shoved the attorney toward the hall. We marched into the office, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The humidity from the plant rooms had drifted down, making the air feel heavy and hothouse thick. Wolfe was back in his chair, looking as solid as a mountain and just as likely to move. Saul Panzer was gone, slipped out the back to handle his part of the orchestration. On the desk, the brass key, the jar of mace with its crimson ivy, and the blueprints were arranged with the kind geometric precision that Sugg. Instead, they were pieces of a ritual. "Sit, gentlemen," Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. He didn't look at the cops, he looked at Silas Vane. "Mr. Vane, you have been remarkably persistent with your injunctions. It is a pity you didn't apply the same diligence to the security of your partner's basement. If you had, we might not be sitting here with a dead man's secrets and a gardener's shadow in my pantry." Vane sat in the red leather chair, his hands gripping the arms. "I don't know what you're talking about, Wolfe. I want my nephew. He's the heir to the Thorne estate, and he belongs under my roof, not in this tomb of a house. He belongs where he is safe," Wolfe snapped. "And he is not safe at the Oaks. He is not safe because you, Silas, have spent 40 years pretending that the Ivy League cadre was a benevolent investment club instead of a syndicate of thieves. You allowed a man like Himes to cultivate your secrets until the ivy became stronger than the tree it was meant to protect. Now the tree is dead, and the ivy is looking for a new host." The attorney tried to interrupt with a point about legal standing, but Wolfe silenced him with a flick of his finger. It was a small movement, but it had the weight of a falling axe. "Silence," Wolfe commanded. "We are not in a courtroom. We are in a laboratory of logic. Archie, bring the boy down." I went to the 3rd floor and got Julian. He looked better than he had that morning, but his eyes were still wide. The lingering terror. I brought him into the office and stood him near my desk. When he saw Silas, he didn't run to him, he moved closer to me. That told me more than a dozen depositions ever could. "Julian," Wolfe said, his voice softening just a fraction, "look at the key on the desk. Your grandfather gave it to you because he knew that Silas and Clara and the good doctor would never think to look for an oak in a house of God. But Himes knew. Himes has been the gardener for 40 years. He was the one who pruned the witnesses and tended the bribes. He is the one who is currently in the tunnels beneath our feet, waiting for me to give him what he wants." Silas Vane went the color of a bad turnip. "Himes? That's preposterous." "Himes is a servant. He's a non-entity. He is the entity that defines you," Wolfe said. "He is the repository of every sin the cadre ever committed, and he has realized that with Arthur gone, he no longer needs a master. He only needs the ledger that contains the numbered accounts, the names of the bribed officials, and the records of the pruning he performed on your behalf." The room went into a cold, hard silence. The two policemen looked at each other, their hands moving instinctively toward their belts. They were starting to realize that this wasn't a domestic dispute. It was a crime scene in the making. "I have orchestrated a silence, Mr. Vane," Wolfe continued. "I have allowed the gardener to believe that he has us trapped. I have let him see that you are here with the law, creating the perfect noise to cover his final move. But while you were busy with your lawyers, I was busy with the truth. I have sent my agent to the Thorne Memorial Altar at St. Jude's. The ledger is no longer in the oak screen. It is in the hands of the district attorney. That was the bait. It was a beautiful, calculated lie. The ledger was still in the altar, but by claiming it was gone, Wolfe was forcing the gardener's hand. If Himes believed the secret was out, he would stop being a ghost and start being a killer. He wouldn't care about the key anymore. He would care about eliminating the people who could testify against him. "You're lying," Silas hissed. "The ledger, it can't be." "It is," Wolfe said. "And because it is, you are all in grave danger. Himes is not coming for the key, Silas. He is coming for you. You were the money. You were the one who signed the checks for the pruning. Without the ledger to protect him, Himes has no reason to keep you alive." Suddenly the lights in the office flickered, a sharp, stuttering blink that left us in a second of total darkness before they surged back. It was the same trick I'd seen in the basement. The gardener was at the mains. "He's here," I said, stepping in front of Julian and drawing my 38. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at the door toward the kitchen. "Indeed he is, Archie. The orchestration of silence is over. It is time for the gardener to fack. The harvest." The kitchen door did not open with a bang. It swung wide on silent hinges, and there stood Himes. He wasn't the grey shadow I had seen at the Oaks. He was wearing a dark utility suit, and in his hand was a long, thin blade that looked like it had been designed for grafting roses but was currently aimed at Silas Vane's throat. Ivy had finally reached the heart of the house. The office was caught in a freeze frame that had nothing to do with the temperature. Himes stood in the doorway, the light from the desk lamp reflecting off the surgical steel in his hand. He didn't look like a secretary anymore. He looked like the personification of 40 years of buried secrets. His eyes weren't on Wolfe or me. They were fixed on Silas Vane with a cold, focused hatred that made the air in the room feel brittle. Silas was pressed so far back into the red leather chair that I thought he might merge with the upholstery. The two uniformed officers were in the middle of a confused draw, their service revolvers halfway out of their holsters, paralyzed by the realization that the man they had come to serve a warrant on was currently the target of a professional executioner. Wolfe didn't even shift his weight. He sat in his custom-built chair like a Buddha carved from granite, his fingers still interlaced over his middle. "Come in, Mr. Himes," Wolfe said, his voice a calm, resonant bass that seemed to anchor the room. The door was unlocked, as you well know, though I must say the utility suit is a bit dramatic for a Tuesday evening. "I assume you found the tunnels to your liking. Our foundation is quite sturdy, but the mortar in the south wall was always a weakness." Himes didn't move. "The ledger, Wolfe. You said it was gone. You said it was with the district attorney." "I said many things to ensure your arrival," Wolfe remarked, his eyes half closing. "A gardener cannot prune what he cannot see. I needed you in the light where the ivy could be seen for what it is, a parasitic growth that has finally reached the end of its trellis. You aren't here for the ledger, Himes. You are here because you realized that with Arthur Thorne dead, you were the only one left who knew where the bodies were buried, and you didn't want Silas to be the one to tell the story." "He knows nothing," Himes spat, his voice a dry rasp. "He was the wallet. I was the hand. I did a job he was too timid to imagine. And now he wants to hand the boy over to the law. He wants to clear his conscience at my expense." I stepped a fraction to the left, putting myself between Julian and the doorway, my 38 leveled at Himes's chest. "The conscience is a bit crowded tonight, Himes. Why don't you put the knife on the desk? We've got the law right here, and they've got a lot of questions about a certain spice jar and a manhole cover on 34th Street. Himes didn't even look at me. He was still staring at Silas. He killed him, you know. He didn't use a knife. He just didn't give Arthur his Edison. He watched him gasp for air and did nothing, all because he wanted the key. He thought the cadre's money would save his failing firm." Silas Vane erupted then, his face turning a mottled purple. "You lying snake!" "I was in the library. I never went near his room. The orchestration of the summons is complete, Archie," Wolfe interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise like a bell. "Mr. Himes, you have provided the one thing the ledger could not, a confession. Silas Vane's failure to act is as much a murder as your grafting knife would have been. You both are bound by the same vine." The two officers finally found their voices and their courage. "Drop the weapon. Now." Himes looked at the officers, then at Wolfe, and finally at the brass key on the desk. For a second, I thought he was going to the lung, to try and take Silas with him into the dark. But then, the tension seemed to drain out of him. He wasn't a master criminal. He was a man who had been a shadow for so long he had forgotten how to exist in the sun. He dropped the blade onto the rug with a soft thud and held out his hands. "The ivy is dead," Himes whispered. "The oak fell a long time ago." I moved forward and kicked the knife away, while the officers moved in to handle the cuffs. They didn't just take Himes, they took Silas Vane too. The injunction was forgotten, replaced by the weight of a double accusation that was going to keep the DA's office busy for the next year. As they were led out of the Fice, the brownstone seemed to exhale, the pressure that had been building since the morning finally dissipating. Julian Thorne was sitting on the edge of my desk, his head in his hands. I put a hand on his shoulder, but I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. His family was gone, replaced by a ledger and a set of handcuffs. Wolfe waited until the front door slammed shut before he rang for Fritz. When the door opened, Fritz appeared not with more tea, but with 2 bottles of beer and a tray of small toasted sandwiches. He looked at the empty room, then at the knife on the rug, and finally at Wolfe. "The guests have departed, Fritz," Wolfe said, reaching for a bottle, "and they have left a mess. I believe we shall require a thorough cleaning of the basement, and the spice jars. We shall need to replace the mace. It has been contaminated by a lack of imagination." I sat at my desk watching Wolfe drink his beer. The sanctity of the house had been restored, but the cost was etched in the boy's face and the scratch on the floorboards where the knife had fallen. We had found the secrets beneath the ivy, but as always with Wolfe, the harvest was a bitter one. "You knew Himes would come through the kitchen," I said, finally putting my gun away. "That's why you had me check the mace. You wanted him to know we knew he was there." "I wanted him to feel the walls closing in, Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes fixed on the map of the city. "A man who lives in tunnels is easily claustrophobic. He needed to believe the office was his only escape. It was a simple matter of directing the flow of the hunt." He looked at the brass key, still sitting on the blotter. "The ledger is still at St. Jude's, Archie. You will go there tonight and retrieve it. We shall give it to the district attorney ourselves. I will not have Saul Panzer spending any more time in a cold chapel than is strictly necessary." I stood up and reached for my hat. The rain had stopped, and the city was beginning to settle into its nighttime rhythm. The secrets were out, the ivy was pruned, and Nero Wolfe was back in his world, where the only things that mattered were the orchids, the beer, and the next meal. The office was quiet, but it was a courtroom silence after the verdict had been read and the spectators had filed out. Julian Thorne had been taken upstairs by Fritz, who had a way of providing comfort through a bowl of hot bouillon that was more effective than any psychiatric evaluation. That left me, Wolfe, and the brass cathedral key. The 2 uniformed officers had departed with Silas Vane and Himes in tow, their faces a mixture of professional triumph and the shell-shocked realization that they'd just witnessed the dismantling of one of New York's oldest legal dynasties. Wolfe was leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the sprig of crimson ivy. He hadn't touched his second beer. He was in that state of intellectual repose that usually precedes a lecture, and I knew better and to interrupt the process. I sat at my desk, my notebook open, waiting for the final pieces of the puzzle to be laid out on the red leather. The reveal in a Nero Wolfe case isn't just about who pulled the trigger or held the knife. It's about the why and the how, the strategic failures of the guilty that allowed Wolfe to catch them in his net. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration in the still room. The vanity of Silas Vane was his undoing, but it was the desperation of Arthur Thorne that provided the stage. "You asked why Himes didn't simply take the boy while we slept. The answer lies not in Himes's character, but in the nature of the oak itself. The Thorne Memorial Altar at St. Jude's is not merely a piece of woodwork. It is a mechanical vault designed by Arthur Thorne's father, a man who distrusted the very banks he helped to build. The lock requires not just the key, but a specific sequence of pressures on the carved oak leaves surrounding the keyhole, a sequence that Arthur only shared with Julian on his deathbed. So Himes needed Julian to talk," I noted, scribbling the details down. "That's why he didn't just prune him in the hallway. He needed the kid to show him how to dance with the door." "Precisely, and Silas Vane knew it too. Silas was not just a partner in the cadre, he was the primary beneficiary of their pruning service. When the firm began to fail, he turned to the only asset he had left, the secrets buried in that ledger. He did not want the ledger to clear his conscience. He wanted it to restart the blackmail machine. He used the law to try and extract Julian from this house because he knew Himes was closing in. He hoped that by getting the boy into his custody, he could force the secret of the altar out of him before the gardener could get his hands on the brass." Wolfe shifted his weight, the chair groaning under the movement. "The Ivy League cadre was never a fraternity of equals, Archie. It was a hierarchy of fear. Arthur was the architect, Silas was the financier, and Himes was the executor." But as with all such structures, the foundation eventually rotted. Himes realized he was the only one who had actually dirtied his hands. He was the one who trespassed, who observed, who pruned. He grew tired of being a shadow. He wanted to be the tree. "The mace jar," I said, looking at the glass container on the desk. "You said it was a psychological maneuver. Was he trying to scare us into giving up, or was he testing our reaction time?" "Both," Wolfe replied. Himes was a predator who relied on the familiarity of his surroundings. By entering this house and leaving his signature in the pantry, he was attempting to domesticate the threat. He wanted us to feel that his presence was inevitable, that resistance was futile. He assumed that I, a man who prizes his domestic tranquility above all else, would be willing to trade the boy for the return of my privacy. It was a grave miscalculation. He did not realize that I considered a trespass in my kitchen to be a declaration of total war. Wolfe reached out and finally picked up the brass key. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly. The 14th guest in the previous case we handled was a ghost of international proportions, but the gardener was a ghost of a different sort. He was the man you pass on the street every day without seeing. He was the one who held the door for you, who delivered your mail, who manicured your lawn, all while recording the weaknesses of your life. The Ivy League cadre functioned because people like Silas Vane believed that men like Himes were invisible. They were wrong. Himes was the only one who was truly seeing. "And the blood on the ivy?" I asked. "You said it was a signature, a literal one," Wolfe said. Himes used a chemical compound, a mixture of iron oxide and a specific botanical resin, to stain the sprigs. It was a technique used by the cadre in the early days to mark the files of their targets. It was meant to signify that the ivy had taken root. By using it on Arthur and then sending it to Julian, Himes was announcing that the final harvest had begun. He was reclaiming the symbols of his servitude and turning them into the instruments of his dominance. I looked at the blueprints again. The tunnels, the missing stones, the hidden chambers. It all seemed like something out of a Victorian thriller, yet it had happened right beneath my feet. Nero Wolfe had won not through action, but through the superior application of a disciplined mind. He had seen the pattern in the ivy before the first leaf had even touched the brownstone. "Tonight, Archie, you will go to St. Jude's," Wolfe repeated, his tone returning to its usual businesslike clip. "The ledger is there, and it must be removed. I will not have the sanctity of a chapel further desecrated by the remnants of the Thorne legacy. We shall deliver it to the district attorney with a summary of our findings. Julian Thorne will be the ward of the state until his majority, but he will be a free man. The oak has fallen and the ivy has been uprooted. It is a satisfactory conclusion." He rang the bell for Fritz, "And now I believe it is nearly dinner." I have a sudden craving for something that has never seen a garden, perhaps a well-aged steak grilled to the point of perfection. The greenery has lost its appeal for the evening. I stood up, feeling the weight of the day finally settle in my shoulders. The reveal was complete. The logic had been applied, and the gardener was in a cell where the only thing he could prune was his own regrets. I headed for the hall, the brass key heavy in my pocket. The Ivy League cadre was a memory, and West 35th Street was once again the center of a very orderly universe. The following morning the brownstone had reclaimed its usual atmosphere of heavy scholarly peace. The rain had washed the city's face, and the sun was currently fighting a winning battle against the autumn. Clouds, casting long, pale rectangles of light across the office rug. I had spent the better part of the previous night at St. Jude's, and let me tell you, navigating a dark chapel with a brass cathedral key and a flashlight is a lot less romantic than it sounds. The carved oak screen had yielded its secret with a reluctant wooden groan, and the ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume that felt like it was made of lead, was now in the hands of a very startled but grateful assistant district attorney. I was at my desk, finishing the final report for the files, and trying to decide if I could justify a new pair of shoes on the expense account after all the tunnel crawling I'd done. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms where he'd been since 9. For a man who had just dismantled a 40-year-old criminal conspiracy, he was remarkably focused on the humidity levels of his intermediate house. He hadn't mentioned Himes, Silas Vane, or the ivy once since breakfast. In Wolfe's world, once a problem has been solved and the logic has been verified, it ceases to exist. Julian Thorne had left an hour ago. We'd arranged for him to stay with a distant, respectable aunt in Connecticut, one of the few members of the family who didn't have a motive for murder or a history with the cadre. He had looked older, quieter, but the haunted expression in his eyes had begun to soften. He'd thanked Wolfe with a sincerity that was almost painful to watch, and Wolfe had responded with a grunt that I translated as, "You're welcome. Now please don't let the door hit you on the way out." Fritz came with the mail and a fresh beer bottle on a silver tray. He looked at the spot where Heems had stood with the knife and gave the rug a suspicious squint, as if he expected a sprig of ivy to sprout from the floorboards. "Everything is in order, Archie?" he asked, his voice a comfortingly domestic baritone. "As in order as it ever gets, Fritz," I said, leaning back. "The basement wall has been patched, the mace has been replaced, and the only greenery left in this house is currently being pampered by the boss on the roof. We're officially out of the landscaping business." Fritz nodded, satisfied, and retreated to the kitchen to begin whatever alchemy he had planned for lunch. A few minutes later the elevator groaned, a sound I've come to associate with the return of the mountain to the plains, and Wolfe entered the office. He didn't go to his desk immediately. He walked over to the globe in the corner and gave it a small, thoughtful spin, watching the continents blur into a single colourful streak. "The world is a very small place, Archie," he remarked, finally taking his seat. "Small enough that the shadow of a secret kept in 1910 can still cast a chill over a house in 1950. The Ivy League cadre believed they could escape the gravity of their own actions. They forgot that time is the ultimate gardener. It does not forget, and it never fails to harvest. Well, the harvest was a bumper." "Crop this year," I said. "Cramer called while you were with the Miltonias. He says Silas Vane is trying to blame everything on Himes, and Himes is currently providing a detailed itinerary of every pruning he did for the firm. It's going to be a long winter at the courthouse." Wolfe sighed, a sound of profound boredom. "The legal system is a necessary but tedious machine, Archie. It focuses on the mechanics of the crime, while I am interested only in the integrity of the solution. The fact remains that Arthur Thorne died because he attempted to use a boy as a shield for his own failures. It is a moral bankruptcy that no ledger can reconcile." He reached for his beer, pouring it with a precision that ensured exactly 1 inch of foam. "And the key, Archie? What did you do with the brass?" "I left it with the DA, I told him. "I figured they'd need it for evidence. Besides, I didn't want it in the house. Every time I looked at it, I felt like I was holding a piece of a tombstone." Wolfe nodded his approval. "A wise decision. We have no use for relics of the past that have lost their purpose. This house is a sanctuary for the living, not a museum for the dead." He opened his book, a new translation of some Greek philosopher who had probably been dead as long as Cadre's secrets, and signaled that the conversation was over. I watched him for a moment, the sunlight catching the gold of his ring and the vast yellow expanse of his vest. To anyone else, he was just a sedentary man. The beer and a book. To me, he was the only fixed point in a city that was constantly trying to pull itself apart. I stood up and went to the window, looking out at the street. The afternoon traffic was picking up, and a delivery truck was double-parked near the corner. It was a normal, noisy, chaotic Manhattan day. The ivy was gone, the oak had fallen, and the brownstone on West 35th Street was once again a fortress of silence in the middle of the storm. "Archie," Wolfe's voice came from behind me, not looking up from his page. "Yeah? Tell Fritz that for lunch I should like the trout with a very light almond sauce. And remind him, no garnishes. I have developed a temporary aversion to parsley." I smiled and headed for the kitchen. "No garnishes, Wolfe, just the trout and the truth. I think we can manage that." The office door closed behind me, sealing in the silence. The case was finished, the accounts were settled, and the only thing left to do was eat. In our world, that's as close to a happy ending as you ever get.